Okay, floor is yours.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Well, thanks for the invitation, and it's very nice to do it this way. Well, I kept the title of my talk, even though just for reasons of consistency. Even though while preparing it, it has more or less evolved into something which is much more specific than just being about folk psychological descriptions. So basically what I want to talk about, and I think it's a very nice, like, complementary talk to Julian's talk about delusion. So I want to discuss phenomena, which for now I will not theoretically define very strictly, where symptoms in psychiatry are usually understood as propositional attitudes. So I think delusional thought or delusional belief is one very, very well-known example of this. Other examples are addictive desires, for example. And also to show that I'm interested in a broader category of states. Also, I think phobic fears could be an example, which on a broad understanding are also sometimes discussed as propositional attitudes. What I am interested in is not specifically in pathological manifestations, but in the more general question. So when we ascribe propositional attitudes, what do we actually ascribe? And specifically also on the question, to what extent can they be said to describe facts? So as a general framework, I hold that folk psychology is a very multivarious practice with different kinds of aims. But that one of the aims is also descriptive. So that's where the interest in the question comes from. So what actually are we describing when we are ascribing propositional attitudes to people? And the kind of account that I will defend is often taken to be problematic in pathological situations, so to say. So that's also why I think it's interesting to discuss it here and to see whether this is actually difficult or whether there is a way to also make sense of things like delusional beliefs and addictive desires and so on. So just as a demarcation, I mean, as I said, for now, I don't have I want to start with a very broad notion, which has not been theoretically defined. But of course, we should agree on what kind of phenomena or states I am interested in. So I am looking at phenomena which can be described in this way by saying, well, there's an agent and then there's an evaluative term. Then there is the that X, the propositional clause, so to say, that connects these things together. And so this means that I do not commit to classic belief desire theory, where there are only two kinds of propositional attitudes with a different direction of fit, beliefs and desires. I think that's a specific way to understand this, but not necessarily the best way. So I do not commit to that. And I also do not commit to the idea that a propositional attitude needs to be an attitude towards a proposition. I mean, I think that's an open question. What makes a propositional attitude actually propositional? So that's also one of the things that I want to talk about in the talk. So this is the only framework that I will assume for now. And as you have seen from the abstract, what I want to do is to defend a broadly Rylean account of what propositional attitudes are, and to find out, so he understands them as multi-track dispositions, and that is a notion which has also come up in more recent literature on propositional attitudes. And the reason why I want to focus on Ryle is not that I think that the ideas that I will present are only found in Ryle, or probably the combination of ideas is only found in Ryle, but any ideas is probably also developed by other authors. But I think he's a very interesting author because I think he's really an undervalued source for situated cognition more broadly. And just to have a quote for that is this quote, which I think also shows that Ryle had a great sense of humor. So this is a quote from his last letter to Dennett in 76, where he said, "I thought well of your photo review, but for reasons that I've forgotten, I am anti-photo." Obviously the photo review was Dennett's review of the language of thought. So I'm pretty sure that Ryle was perfectly aware of the reasons why he would be anti-photo. This is one, of course, of also the language of thought in the introductory chapter. Fodor specifically targets Ryle as like having proposing his own cognitivist picture of the mind as an alternative to Ryle's position. And most people will know, of course, Ryle's point about category mistakes, his anti-Cartesianism, and probably also, especially in this crowd, his work on knowing how and knowing that. But in his later work, he has done many interesting things, very essayistic, short pieces about cognition, particularly about thinking, that I consider to be really very an interesting philosophical source for thinking about several questions that come up in situated cognition. He was often, of course, seen as a behaviorist, and I think I will very easily show that this is a severe misinterpretation, but by now there have been several authors who have already emphasized that this is a misinterpretation, so that will not be my main point. Okay, so that is a kind of background why I chose to focus on Ryle's work. And I will also try to also connect the points that he makes with more recent discussions on these questions. So, how does Ryle think about propositional attitudes? Well, I wanted to start with an example about beliefs. He doesn't talk a lot about beliefs, actually. He talks about also what it means to expect, what it means to know. But also, this is a quote which is specifically about beliefs, so I thought that would be most informative to connect to more recent debates. So what he says is, to believe that the ice is thin is a propensity not only to make certain theoretical moves, but also to make certain executive and imaginative moves, as well as to have certain feelings. But these things hang together on a common propositional hook. And I think there's a lot in this quote which is interesting to discuss. So I will come back to the idea of a propositional hook later in the talk, because I think that points to what actually makes an attitude a propositional attitude. But of course, this claim doesn't say much in itself. I think it also already very clearly shows that Ryle's not a behaviorist, because he includes feelings. And this is something which is glaringly obvious from his later work, that he was mostly concerned with the question how to understand thinking and also things like imagination. And you could even, when I was preparing this talk, I thought that you could even say that Ryle, in a way, himself was also concerned with the scaling up problem, specifically because he had done a lot of work on know-how. But then in his later life, he also came to address the question, well, a lot of what we do is covered by know-how, but how should we actually think about phenomena like pondering and being wrapped up in thoughts? And there's this relatively well-known paper about what Le Penseur is doing when he is like having his hand like this. And so I think the fact that he has been interested in this question for quite a substantial part of his life already shows that he cannot have been a behaviorist in any meaningful sense. Okay, but of course, his main aim was to try to understand these kind of phenomena, which you could call mental phenomena, without resorting to the assumption that there have to be inner goings on. So either inner objects that were like the manifestations of these states, or also inner incidents. So he thought that mental states were neither objects nor incidents, and then of course the question is, what are they? And he basically introduces the notion of disposition as a stable pattern which is not an object or an incident. So it's partly also a negative view. So what I will say a bit more about multi-track dispositions, and then in the second part of the talk, I want to address two problems that you could raise with regard to disposition. The first is with respect to pathology. Are like pathological attitudes actually coherent and stable enough to count as propositional attitudes or to count as multi-track dispositions in Ryle sense? And this also very closely connects to the questions discussed in Julian's talk. And the second question is, are propositional attitudes representation hungry? And there I will say a little bit about how Ryle thinks about representation, language and representation more specifically. If we say that beliefs or propositional attitudes in general are multi-track disposition, the question of course comes up, well, what is their like metaphysical status? Do they actually exist, or what do we ascribe when you actually ascribe these kind of states? Here it might be informative to compare Ryle's view with Eric Schwitzgebel's view, which is very closely related. In this paper, or I think it's in the 2010 paper, that he actually says that, well, at first he thought that Ryle was behaviorist, and that his, like Schwitzgebel's innovation was to say, no, we should also include elements of the patterns such as feelings and imaginations and so on. But then he found out, for example, in this previous quote, that maybe Ryle also included these, so they might be more closely related philosophically than he first thought. I still think there's a very important difference. Maybe I should first just read the quote and to talk a little bit about the differences. So he talks about what it means to regard one's colleagues as a talented group. It is to live a certain way. It is in part to be disposed to affirm, should appropriate circumstances arise, that one's colleagues are a talented group. So this is about saying things. But more than that, it is to feel certain pride to be among them, perhaps a slightly embarrassed pride if one sees oneself as not quite on par. It is to be unsurprised when they collect honors. It is to think of them as natural choices to contribute to compilation in their areas of interest. It is to have, in general, though probably only imperfectly, a certain profile of outward behavior and inner experience. So the question, what is the metaphysical status of having these kind of dispositions? Well, I think both in Schwitzgebel's and also in Ryle's own view, the profile is really there in the world, so to say. So in that sense, ascriptions of beliefs and states, in these kind of states in general, are factual in that they actually track something which is actually there. But that doesn't mean that the belief is also an entity, so to say. So they are like, it is in a way a factual view, but it is also in a sense an anti-metaphysical view. So that is a bit difficult to get at what that means. And I found this quote from The Concept of Mind, which says a little bit about this. So it says, dispositional statements are neither reports of observed nor observable states of affairs, nor yet reports of unobserved or unobservable states of affairs. They narrate no incidents, but their jobs are intimately connected with narratives of incidents, for if they are true, they are satisfied by narrated incidents. So I take this to mean that there's definitely a fact of the matter often regarding the question what we believe or desire or whatsoever, because it is actually, if certain elements of the pattern are there in the world, then the claim that a person has a certain belief can be true. So for example, to have it is definitely a fact that I believe that the earth is round. I mean, I don't think that you need to be very complicated or constructivist or whatever about this. I would say, yeah, that's a clear fact. It is what I believe. That doesn't mean that there is always a fact of the matter. And specifically, Schwitzgebel has been very good in pointing out that there's some inherent indeterminacy about propositional attitudes, so that in many cases it's not clear whether we believe something or not, and that is actually a very crucial part of the whole practice, that there is this indeterminacy. But that doesn't mean that there is like indeterminacy all the way, so that we never know. Yes, often we just know, and there's a fact regarding what we believe, for example. And what makes the claim true is these incidents and narratives and manifestations and maybe even objects. I was thinking, so to put it more in a situated framework, for instance, you could say that if you want to know like the political belief of someone, the books a person has in his house might actually be like a fact that actually is a truth maker for having a certain belief. I mean, you have to be very careful about it. You can be mistaken, but you could say that some truth makers exist outside of the person, but are nevertheless like relevant for finding out what a person believes. This is a slightly different interpretation from Ryle than Heras Escribano has in his book on affordances, where he also uses a Rylean framework to account for affordances, whereas he says that it is a non-factual account, and he makes a lot of Ryle's point that ascriptions are of states are like inference tickets, so that is a much more pragmatic way of thinking about these ascriptions. I think he's completely right that there are no entities, so the beliefs do not exist, so to say. So in that sense, Ryle is very you could say, well, I'm anti-factual, it's anti-realist, I would say. But it is a mistake to think that it's a purely instrumental approach. And it's therefore in the same way also very different from Dennett's way of talking about real patterns, because for Dennett, like the only question, the only metaphysical question that you can ask is the question, does it help to ascribe it? And insofar as it helps, the person has its state. So on this understanding, a robot might have beliefs, because just if it's helpful to ascribe it, then the robot has them. I think Ryle will definitely disagree with this. So he would think that there are like states of certain types of beings, namely human beings who can act, and which I will discuss later, who can use language. So that is a very different view. That doesn't mean that he has a completely worked out account of why that would be so. But I think this is definitely the direction that he wants to go into. Okay, so do they exist? Well, no, the attitude itself is not something that exists, but the pattern of truth makers does exist. So what does the pattern show? Well, the pattern shows that an agent engages in a certain relation to the world. And the final point is what I just said, that I think that he didn't explicitly explain that he thought that only beings capable of language and intentional action can engage in such kinds of relations, so that you cannot just ascribe these kind of attitudes to anyone for whom this might have some kind of predictive value. And this also, I think, shows that he was strongly influenced by Wittgenstein, who also, I think, would move in the same direction, as saying that this is something which can only happen in certain forms of life. Okay, so then I already said that somehow language is important for having these kind of relations to the world. And I think this is a good point to talk about propositionality. So he says, well, they all hang on a propositional hook, all these different elements of a dispositional pattern. But what does this actually mean? And here I thought that Dan Hutto's book now I have to look at my bookcase what it's called. Yeah, it's called Folk Psychological Narratives. I thought that was pretty helpful to see what is the difference between attitudes that are only intentional and attitudes that are not only intentional but also propositional. And in the Switchgable quote, it already showed that certain that like what people say is one element in having a certain attitude. And I think the well, the important distinguishing feature of what makes an attitude propositional is that you can only understand what the attitude is, in what way the agent relates to the world, by formulating this in terms of a relation to a proposition. So this doesn't mean that having the relation is a relation to a proposition. No, I mean, the agent relates to the world. This is very, very crucial for understanding what attitudes are. But what makes them propositional is that you can only explain them, but also only have them, these kind of relations, because you have the capacity to formulate them in propositional terms. So this might sound very abstract, but I think you can easily say, for example, that beliefs are always propositional, because you need to be able to understand them as in terms of that clauses. So a belief always has to structure I believe that, and then a proposition. That's the whole idea of having beliefs. But for desires, for example, this is completely different. And this is also something that Ryle observes, that he says many desires are not propositional, because I can desire coffee. Coffee is not a proposition, that's an object. On the other hand, some desires are propositional. So if you have, like the example, I desire that it be the case that, let's say, Ajax once again wins the Champions League. That is a propositional attitude, because in order to grasp what the attitude is, you need to formulate it in terms of a that clause. So the proposal that I also found in Hutto's book was, well, to say, attitudes are propositional if you need this kind of propositional formulation to get at what they are. So in case of desire, you have the desire for coffee. You could also say, well, that's also a propositional attitude, because you can say, I desire that it be the case that I have coffee. Yeah, but I think the mere fact that you can formulate it in such terms doesn't make it a propositional attitude. It needs to be the only possible way to understand what is going on. So what does this mean? I think it means that, well, many desires are actually not propositional attitudes. So that's already a completely different view than the classic Humean belief desire theory. But that also many other attitudes that are not part of that framework could also be propositional attitudes. For example, hopes. I think hoping that, it's always hoping that. So I think hope is also a propositional attitude in this sense. Maybe also fear is a good example. So you can fear objects. You have a fear of spiders. That is not propositional. But you can also fear a specific kind of situation that something will happen. That is a propositional attitude. That also means that you can see what kind of attitudes animals could have. So animals could have fears of objects. They could have desires for things in the world, but they cannot have desires for certain facts to obtain or not to obtain. They can also not have beliefs, for example. So I think that nicely distinguishes what kind of relations to the world you need language for and you don't. Okay, so that's the general framework, and then we get to how to apply this in the pathological case. Well, I think this also already shows that the picture is not straightforward. So I think delusions are also always propositional, because, yeah, you need to phrase them in terms of a relation to a proposition. I thought one very nice example was actually the Capgras delusion, because, for example, you can explain what's going on by saying, well, I think that my husband is not actually my husband. And this shows that this is really a very linguistic interpretation, because you need to understand that you use the word husband twice, but in the first instance, you mean in the dicto meaning, and in the other case, you mean it in the de re meaning, and that there is some kind of tension. And so this is a very complex, abstract way of relating to someone, which, for example, animals could never. I mean, animals could never have the Capgras delusion. I would suggest, but maybe we can talk about that later. Addictive desires are not propositional attitudes most of the time. I mean, they could involve propositional attitudes, but in principle, they are just desires for certain substances or activities or whatever. And so, well, it also shows that animals can also be addicted and have desires. So this is not a specifically language-driven phenomenon. Phobic fears, as I already explained, fear for spiders is not a propositional attitude. Whereas, for example, in a book, this by Jeff Bell, where he, this is about OCD, but he also discusses certain obsessive fears, that he explains that for a month he was completely obsessed by the fear that he had damaged someone else's boat in the harbor while passing it. And that is also a prepositional attitude. You cannot explain what is going on without formulating it in terms of this propositional structure. So what does this show? This shows actually, I think that there is a wide variety of ways in which we can relate to the world, some of which actually require, you could say, a propositional interpretation, and some of which don't. So then we come to the two questions I wanted to discuss that often come up with regard to this kind of account. The first is, well, are pathological attitudes actually stable and coherent enough to count as multi-track disposition? And I included a quote from Maura Tumulty, which specifically frames the problem for dispositionalism. So it can make this distinction between folk psychological categories like believing and imagining, and they're only in subjects who are generally capable of living up to most of folk psychology's normative expectation. And no one suffering from delusions is such a subject. Well, this was precisely, of course, what we were just discussing with Julian. My view on this is that actually the norms, I would say, are much less strict. So, of course, in order to say, well, you can ascribe a belief if there's a certain pattern. A pattern suggests coherence, of course, and also stability. But the question is, how much stability and coherence do you need? And I would say, well, it's actually much less than is often thought. So, for example, with regard to belief, I don't really think that we have very strict rational norms for ascribing beliefs to people. So often one thing that is often mentioned is whether you are sensitive to counter evidence. Well, I think many people in their everyday beliefs are also not very sensitive to counter evidence. So I don't think we really use this as a very strict requirement, which was something also mentioned in the discussion. Well, of course, believing conspiracy theories, which also manifest the same kind of features. So I think our practices of ascribing beliefs are very tolerant, and that is not really a problem that they don't like tick all the boxes. I mean, that doesn't mean that you don't need to have a story about what actually makes the pattern a pattern. But I think that all you actually need is the kind of rules that come with language use and come with intentional action. So it's very basic sense-making capacities that keep the thing together, so to say. And the question whether delusions fit that mold is an open one, of course. And I think also cases differ, as also showed up in the discussion before. People who are completely lost and have no contact with the environment might really have a problem in still having beliefs. But in case of more isolated delusions, this might be less of a problem. So I think in some cases you can say that delusional belief is a belief, and in some cases you probably cannot. But for this kind of account, that is not really the most crucial question, because the main distinction is the attitude propositional or is it just intentional? And the whole idea of Ryle's analysis of the kind of mental phenomena is the variety, and is the fact that there is not that we have so many different ways in relating to the world, and that some of them are, of course, more in touch with the reality than others. But that, well, there's a lot of ways in which we can actually make sense of this. So then the second question, that this will be the last point that I make. Let's see how much time I still have. I think about 5 minutes, is that right?
I have you, you're just hitting, well, oh yeah, I have you 30 minutes talking. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, then I don't need to hurry, but maybe I don't. So this is, of course, the difficult thing that came up. Like, okay, this has been a very language-heavy talk. And when you're asking the question, well, propositional attitudes often are thought to suffer from the scaling up problem because they are higher forms of cognition and so on. In one sense, the Rylean account of propositional attitudes doesn't have that problem, because the whole idea is that the attitudes, it's neither an object nor an incident. So in that sense, you don't have the question, does having this kind of objects or incidents rely on having representations? No, I mean, that question has disappeared. But of course, to the cost of the coming up of another question. Well, okay, but if having beliefs and hopes and expectations and whatever relies on the possession of linguistic capacities, then it means that they are language hungry. So they rely on being able to use language. And then you need to answer the question, is language use actually representation hungry? And I must say, this is a question that for me came up because I was invited for this workshop. So I thought, yeah, okay, it's an interesting question. I haven't worked on it before. And then when I was preparing the talk, and I thought, well, at first I had only some remarks on this, the ways you could think. But then I thought yesterday, well, it might be interesting to look at what Ryle actually says, whether he says anything about language and representation. And it turns out that he did. And I was pretty surprised by what he actually says about this. So this is the very, very speculative part of the talk, which I only found out about yesterday. And I thought it might be interesting to discuss. Because Ryle actually says that language is not a representational system. And to show how this works, you should know that he has a very Wittgensteinian view of language, where meaning is used. And I mean, it's clear that he has built on philosophical investigations here, also regarding the timing of his writings. So the quote here from the Theory of Meaning from 57 is, to know what an expression means is to know how it may and may not be employed and the rules governing its employment. So his view is that language is a toolkit. So, and the meaning of the language is the way we can actually use it. So that's the background. And then what he says about representations, he says, well, there are definitely languages that are representational, such as mathematics. But natural language is not a representational system, because what is a representation? He says that representations are actually stand-ins, and that these are like symbols. They do the job of something else that cannot do the job or is not available or whatever. So one example that he uses is topographical maps. So he says the sign, well, actually on this picture, it's usually not a plus, but a plus with a square underneath it. That is a symbol for the word church or iglesia or whatever language. So the sign does the job of the word, because if you would have to write all the words on the map, they would fill up the space and that would be inconvenient. So the word cannot do the job, so the sign does the job for the word. And then he says, well, a flint or a boot heel can do duty for a hammer, but a hammer does not do duty for anything else. It does its own job. In other words, it is, whereas it's okay to say that the sign plus represents the word church, it is crazy to say that the word church represents a church, because the word doesn't do the job of the actual church. The words do their own job. So in the same way, this works for mathematical language. So the sign plus represents the word addition, for example, or add. But the word add doesn't represent actual adding or something. No. So in that sense, he thinks that natural language is not fulfilling the job of actual objects in the world. So what is the job of words? In this case, he talks about words. well, there he makes a distinction. He says the word church doesn't represent a church, it signifies a church in a very literal sense, like it points to a church. And I think this is a very, I really, this idea has kept me awake last night. I must admit that I really, at first I thought this is just, I mean, is this really a distinction, representing and signifying? And I mean, I'm not a philosopher of language, so, but then I thought, actually, if you have the background of the whole meaning is use framework of thinking about language, this might actually make sense to say, well, what is the role of language is actually pointers for things in reality. And this might also show how we actually learn language, because I mean, you have apples and you have people saying, you know, this is the apple, this is pointing. And this is the basis for at some point allowing you to actually use these words for pointers. And this becomes, of course, they're much more and more abstract and so on. But the basis is still that the word points to the reality and not represents reality. Okay, so this is all I have to say about this. And of course, this doesn't answer all questions about representation, because you could still say, well, in order to actually use the word church, you need at some point to have some kind of abstract understanding of what the word points at, and that might still be a representation. So he still has the same problem, but then just moved away, so to say. Well, maybe we can discuss that, but at least, I mean, I hadn't expected this, and I think it's a pretty interesting idea about language. So to conclude, the main thing I wanted to show in the talk is that it is interesting and possibly helpful to think about things like delusional beliefs, obsessive thoughts, or addictive desire in terms of attitudes, even though it turns out that actually not all attitudes are actually also propositional. So I thought the distinction between propositional and merely intentional attitudes is a helpful one. But also that the fact that many attitudes are propositional is very important in understanding the kind of relations people engage with. So I was also thinking about Adrian's talk yesterday about, or actually after the talk, I read his paper about OCD and also the notion of grip there. And whereas I think I agree that like the basic feeling, for example, in obsessive thought is this very indeterminate feeling of things being wrong. I think that precisely the fact that it evolves into a relation with regard to a specific thought, like I have damaged this boat, I must fix this. This is an interpretation, but that also is a form of trying to regain grip, so to say. So I think even though it is suboptimal, it's definitely an attempt to actually grasp this feeling in linguistic terms, which is a form of sense making, which is, I think, very important in understanding what is going on. So that was it, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Annemarie, for this wonderful